Sevastopol was the first ship completed of the Gangut-class battleships of the Imperial Russian Navy, built before World War I. The Ganguts were the first class of Russian dreadnoughts. She was named after the Siege of Sevastopol during the Crimean War. She was completed during the winter of 1914–15, but was not ready for combat until mid-1915. Her role was to defend the mouth of the Gulf of Finland against the Germans, who never tried to enter, so she spent her time training and providing cover for minlaying operations. Her crew joined the general mutiny of the Baltic Fleet after the February Revolution and joined the Bolsheviks later that year. She was laid up in 1918 for lack of manpower, but her crew joined the Kronstadt Rebellion of 1921. She was renamed Parizhskaya Kommuna after the rebellion was crushed to commemorate the Paris Commune and to erase the ship's betrayal of the Communist Party. She was recommissioned in 1925 and refitted in 1928 in preparation for her transfer to the Black Sea the following year. Parizhskaya Kommuna and the Kreuzer-Prof in turn ran into a severe storm in the Bay of Biscay that severely damaged Parizhskaya Kommuna's false bow. They had to put into Brest for repairs, but reached Sevastopol in January 1930. Parizhskaya Kommuna was comprehensively reconstructed in two stages during the 1930s that replaced her boilers, upgraded her guns, augmented her anti-aircraft armament, modernized her fire control systems and gave her anti-torpedo bulges. During World War II she provided gunfire support during the Siege of Sevastopol and related operations until she was withdrawn from combat in April 1942 when the risk from German aerial attack became too great. She was retained on active duty after the war until she became a training ship in 1954. She was broken up in 1956–57. Design. Sevastopol was 180 meters long at the waterline and 181.2 meters long overall. She had a beam of 26.9 meters and a draft of 8.99 meters, 49 centimeters more than design. Her displacement was 24,800 tons at load, over 1,500 t more than her design displacement of 23,288 t. Sevastopol's machinery was built by the Baltic Works. 10 Parsons-type steam turbines drove the 4 propellers. The engine rooms were located between turrets 3 and 4 in 3 transverse compartments. The outer compartments each had a high-pressure head and reverse turbine for each wing propeller shaft. The central engine room had 2 each low-pressure head and a stern turbines as well as 2 cruising turbines driving the 2 center shafts. The engines had a total designed output of 42,000 shaft horsepower, but they produced 52,000 shp during her sister Poltava's full-speed trials on the 21st of November 1915 and gave a top speed of 24.1 knots. 25 Yarrow Admiralty-type small-tube boilers provided steam to the engines at a designed working pressure of 17.5 standard atmospheres. Each boiler was fitted with Thornycroft oil sprayers for mixed oil coal burning. They were arranged in 2 groups. The forward group consisted of 2 boiler rooms in front of the second turret, the foremost of which had 3 boilers while the second one had 6. The rear group was between the second and third turrets and comprised 2 compartments, each with 8 boilers. At full load she carried 1,847.5 long tons of coal and 700 long tons of fuel oil, and that provided her range of 3,500 nautical miles at a speed of 10 knots. Her main armament consisted of a dozen Obukovsky 12-inch pattern 1907 52 caliber guns mounted in 4 triple turrets distributed the length of the ship. The Russians did not believe that super-firing turrets offered any advantage, as they discounted the value of axial fire and believed that super-firing turrets could not fire while over the lower turret because of muzzle blast problems. They also believed that distributing the turrets and their associated magazines over the length of the ship improved the survivability of the ship. 16 4.7-INCH 50 caliber pattern 1905 guns were mounted in casemates to defend the ship against torpedo boats. She completed with 2 3-inch 30 caliber Lender anti-aircraft guns mounted on the quarterdeck. Other AA guns were probably added during the course of World War I, but details are lacking, although Conway says that 4 75mm were added to the roofs of the end turrets during the war. 4 17.7-INCH submerged torpedo tubes were mounted with 3 torpedoes for each tube. Service. Sevastopol was built by the Baltic Works in St. Petersburg. Her keel was laid down on the 16th of June 1909 and she was launched on the 10th of July 1911. She was commissioned on the 30th of November 1914 and reached Helsingfors late the next month, where she was assigned to the 1st Battleship Brigade of the Baltic Fleet. Sevastopol and her sister Gangut provided distant cover for mine-laying operations south of Liepaja on the 27th of August, the furthest that any Russian dreadnought ventured out of the Gulf of Finland during World War I. She ran aground on the 10th of September and was under repair for 2 months. On the 17th of October, a half-charge of powder was dropped and ignited when it impacted the floor of the forward magazine. Flooding the magazine prevented an explosion, but the fire killed 2 men and burned a number of others. She saw no action of any kind during 1916, but hit underwater rocks twice that year, suffering minor damage each time. Her crew joined the general mutiny of the Baltic Fleet on the 16th of March 1917, after the idle sailors received word of the February Revolution in St. Petersburg. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk required the Soviets to evacuate the base at Helsinki in March 1918 to have them interned by newly independent Finland. Even though the Gulf of Finland was still frozen over, Sevastopol and her sisters led the first group of ships out on the 12th of March and reached Kronstadt 5 days later in what became known as the Ice Voyage. A crew of the Sevastopol joined the Kronstadt Rebellion of March 1921. She returned fire when the Bolsheviks began to bombard Kronstadt Island and was hit by 3 12-inch shells that killed or wounded 102 sailors. After the rebellion was bloodily crushed, she was renamed Parizhskaya Kommuna after the Paris Commune on the 31st of March 1921. She was refitted several times before she was recommissioned on 17 September 1925. She was refitted again in 1928 at the Baltic shipyard, in preparation for her transfer to the Black Sea Fleet. Her forward funnel was raised and the upper part was angled aft in an attempt to keep the exhaust gases out of the control and gunnery spaces, while 3 3-inch Lender air guns were added to the roofs of the fore and aft turrets. She received some additional range finders and she was given a false bow to improve her sea-keeping ability. She sailed for the Black Sea on the 22nd of November 1929, in company of the Curse of Profintern, encountering a bad storm in the Bay of Biscay. The open-topped bow lacked enough drainage and tended to trap a lot of water, which badly damaged both the false bow and the supporting structure. Parizhskaya Kommuna was forced to put into Brest for repairs, which included the removal of the bulwark that retained so much water. Both ships arrived at Sevastopol on the 18th of January 1930, and Parizhskaya Kommuna became the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet. Reconstruction.She temporarily mounted an imported Heinkel aircraft catapult atop the third turret between 1930 and 1933. It was transferred to the cruiser Krasny Kavkaz when Sevastopol began the first stage of her reconstruction in November 1933. This was based on that done for her sister, Oktyabskaya Revolyutsiya, but was even more extensive. Her rear superstructure was enlarged and a new structure was built just forward of it, which required the repositioning of the mainmast forward. This did not leave enough room for a derrick, as was fitted in Mara, and two large booms were fitted to handle aircraft while the existing boat cranes remained in place. The mast had to be reinforced by two short legs to handle the weight of the booms and the loads. Her false bow was reworked into a real forecastle like those fitted to her sisters. All 25 of her old boilers were replaced by a dozen oil-fired boilers originally intended for the Borodino-class battle cruisers. The space saved was used to add another inboard longitudinal watertight bulkhead that greatly improved her underwater protection. Her turrets were modified to use a fixed loading angle of 6 degrees and fitted with more powerful elevating motors which increased the rate of fire to 2 rounds per minute. The maximum elevation was increased to 40 degrees, which extended the range to 32,320 yards, and they were redesignated as MK3-12 mod. She landed her old Lender A air guns and replaced them with 6 semi-automatic 45mm 21K AA guns, 3 atop the fore and aft turrets. 376.2-MAL-LIMETER-34K each were mounted on platforms on the fore and aft superstructures, as well as a total of 12.7-MAL-LIMETER-DSHKM machine guns. Her fire control system was completely revised with a pair of KDP-6 fire control director, equipped with 2 6-meter ice rangefinders positioned atop both superstructures. Her original Polonargo clock mechanical fire control computer was replaced with a copy of the Vickers Limited fire control computer, designated AKUR by the Soviets, as well as a copy of a Sperry stable vertical gyroscope. She also received the first stabilized anti-aircraft directors in the Soviet fleet, SVP-1s, that were fitted on each side of the forward superstructure. They were manually stabilized and less than satisfactory, as the men manning them had difficulties keeping the sights on the horizon while the ship's motions were violent. Parizhskaya Kommuna finished the first stage of her reconstruction in January 1938 with unresolved stability issues derived from all of the additional top weight. The options to cure this were discussed at length until Marshal Voroshilov, the People's Commissar for Defense, approved the addition of anti-torpedo bulges in 1939, which would increase the ship's underwater protection and rectify her stability problem. The second part of the reconstruction was carried out between December 1939 and July 1940. A pair of bulges were fitted that extended from the forward magazine to the rear magazine that increased the ship's beam by 5.62 meters. They had an unusual form that consisted of an outer void compartment intended to weaken the explosive force of the torpedo, backed by a relatively narrow section immediately adjacent to the original hull that extended from above the waterline to the bottom of the bilge. This was divided into 2 compartments, the lower of which was kept full full of either fuel oil or water to absorb splinters and fragments from the explosion, while the upper compartment was filled with small watertight tubes intended to preserve the ship's waterplane area and minimize flooding from gunfire hits around the waterline. The underwater torpedo tubes were incompatible with the bulges and were removed at this time. The bulges increased her standard displacement to 30,395 tons, increased her metacentric height to 2.03 meters and reduced her speed to 21.5 knots. The Soviets took advantage of her extra stability to reinforce her deck armor by completely replacing her middle deck armor with 76.2-MALLIMETER cemented armor plates originally intended for Admiral Nakhimov-class cruisers. These were not ideal as they were harder than desirable for deck plates, but they did have the prime virtue of being free. At some point, the exact date is unknown, her 45 mm guns were removed and 16 37mm 70K automatic AA guns were added, 3 each on the fore and aft turret tops and 12 in the superstructures. World War II. 4 of Parazhskaya Kommuna's 120 mm guns were landed shortly before the 22nd of June 1941. When the Germans invaded, she was in Sevastopol, but she was evacuated to Novorossiysk the 30th of October after the Germans had breached Soviet defensive lines near the Perekopasmus. During 28-29 November, she bombarded German and Romanian troops south of Sevastopol with 146 12-inch and 299,120 mm shells. She steamed into Sevastopol's South Bay on the 29th of December and fired 179 and 265,120 mm shells at German troops before embarking 10-25 wounded and departing in company with the cruiser Molotov on the 31st. She bombarded German positions south of Feodosia on the evening of 4-5 January 1942, and on the 12th of January, Parazhskaya Kommuna provided gunfire support during Soviet landings behind German lines along the southern coast of the Crimea. 3 days later, she bombarded German positions west and north of Feodosia on the nights of 26-28 February in support of an offensive by the 44th Army. She fired her last shots of the war at targets near Feodosia during the nights of 20-22 March 1942 before returning to Poti, Georgia, to have her worn-out 12-inch guns relined. By the time this was finished, the Soviets were unwilling to expose such a prominent ship to German air attacks, which had already sunk a number of cruisers and destroyers. She returned to her original name on the 31st of May 1943, but remained in Poti until late 1944 when she led the surviving major units of the Black Sea Fleet back to Sevastopol on the 5th of November. Lend-Lease British Type 290 and 291 air warning radars were fitted during the war. She was awarded the Order of the Red Banner on 8 July 1945. She was reclassified as a school battleship on 24 July 1954 and stricken on 17 February 1956. She was scrapped at Sevastopol in 1956-57. Bibliography. Gardner, Robert Gray, Randall eds. Conway's All the World's Fighting Ships, 1906-1922. Annapolis, Naval Institute Press. ISBN 0851772455. McLaughlin, Stephen. Russian and Soviet Battleships. Annapolis, MD, Naval Institute Press. ISBN 1-55750-4814. Rowe, Jürgen. Chronology of the War at Sea 1939 to 1945, The Naval History of World War II. Annapolis, MD, Naval Institute Press, ISBN 1-591141192.